We're circling back to the Shroud of Turin today, yet again, which, in the words of, I like this, historian John Walsh, is either the most awesome and instructive relic of Christ in existence, or it is one of the most ingenious, most unbelievably clever products of the human mind and hand on record. It is either one or the other. There is no middle ground. I'll be right back. Hey there, Gracious Gang. It's Mike from thegraciousguest.org here with you today. Welcome to the YouTube channel. Welcome to the podcast. If you're new, make sure you go back and check out some old programs. So you got all kinds of stuff. Nothing's really old. And all of these topics and conversations are always interesting, intriguing, kind of thought-provoking. Make sure you subscribe to this YouTube channel, like this content, share this content far and wide. If you're listening to the podcast version, same sorts of things, right? Make sure you give us a good review, give us a good rating in whatever it is, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify. It's all over the place. Anywhere you get podcasts, you can get the Gracious Guest Show. So, welcome today. We are, as I said, circling back to an increasingly popular topic, the Shroud of Turin. Those of you who have been on this channel before, who've seen my interviews before, know that it is a recurring subject, a recurring topic. Before I did any Shroud of Turin videos on my YouTube channel, I had maybe about 100 subscribers. Now we're almost at 800. And so that's not just for Shroud videos, but the Shroud of Turin, the Sudarium of Oviedo, very, very intriguing, popular topics. And so I like to come back and give you this content that I know you're interested in. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Joe Marino, who is a syndonologist. It comes from the Greek word, I believe, for shroud. So a shroud researcher. I've had other shroud researchers on as well, people that are involved in research of the Shroud of Turin in different ways, different capacities. And we've been trying to come at this from a few different angles. You know, we've looked at, with Guy Powell, last time we talked about the Shroud, we looked at his sort of historical fiction book that is trying to fill in the gaps, so to speak, on if the Shroud of Turin, the cloth that's in Turin in Italy, that we know has been there since the 1500s. We know where it was before that, going back to Lire, France in the mid-1300s. The question then becomes, is that actually the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Now, we don't have a strict historical record of that cloth that's in Turin right now before about 1356 when it was first publicly displayed, okay? But does that mean it's not the burial cloth of Jesus? Well, of course not. You know, the question is, well, where was it before that? And that's what Guy attempts to kind of piece together in his book. And we've looked at all kinds of other related interesting information about the image of the man on the shroud, features of the image itself, very curious mysteries about it. And today we're taking a closer look specifically at the controversial issue. Hey, it's YouTube, right? The controversial issue of the dating of the cloth. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, and for those of you who are a little aware but maybe a little rusty on this, in 1988, under the auspices of the British Museum, there was a long-planned and prepared for carbon 14 dating of the Shroud of Turin. The results came back in October of 1988 and said that the Shroud of Turin was only dateable. I should say, the age of the Shroud of Turin put it supposedly between 1260 AD and 1390 AD. In other words, right around the time that we first have a historical record of this cloth in Lire, France. So, basically, in the wake of that, there was this widespread rejection of the authenticity of the shroud. Hey, look, see, this carbon dating has proved that it's a fake, it's a medieval hoax. So medieval hoax became the very standard way of dismissing the Shroud of Turin. Well, for a lot of reasons, that carbon dating was something that many, many people were not willing to just immediately accept because there were a lot of questions raised. There were a lot of problems, and we now know this beyond the shadow of a doubt, and no one has really explored this maybe in more depth than Joe Marino, who's coming on the program here today. This is a pretty massive tome, as you can see here. I've not nearly worked my way through it. I've been highlighting stuff along the way. The 1988 C14 dating of the Shroud of Turin, a stunning expose, which you can get. I have links below to Joe's Amazon page. Heavily, heavily detailed, meticulously footnoted, tremendous amount of almost, it almost give you a headache in terms of the the raw detail in it, tracing from many, many, many decades back all the way through the 1988 dating and down to more modern times. Joe gets into all kinds of curious details about how many different entities were involved in preparing that carbon dating, how long it took to prepare it, how the protocols that were agreed upon for it were ignored or just basically brushed to the side. There's a lot of problems with the 1988 carbon dating, and so it's a complex issue. It's one that we don't have time to get into every little detail in his book, but I was just absolutely delighted to have this conversation with Joe about this question of how old is the Shroud of Turin. Let's check it out. All right, Joe Marino, thank you so much today for being my gracious guest.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Glad to be here.
Well, and it's something I know I got in touch with you a while back, and we've been wanting to put this together for a while, and I was busy with final exams and all that fun kind of stuff that teachers have to do. So here we are. It's summer 22 when we're recording this. And for our viewers, for listeners who are listening to this in the audio version, I just thought we could start with you just want to give a little bit of your own background, particularly as it might relate to just sort of how you got sort of how the Shroud got on your radar in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I was born in the mid 50s in St. Louis, Missouri. I was born and raised a Catholic, went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school. Uh, from high school, wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I went to work for the government, federal government, for a couple of years. Um, while I did go to college the first 2 years. And after 2 years of college, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. So quit school and stayed with the federal government for a while. And I I I guess like many people growing up in the 70s, I had become agnostic as far as my religious faith went, but I didn't lose interest in religion and philosophy. Although I have to say, for a few years, I was so tired of school. Um, I think for a few years, all I read was the sports page and the comics. But then I did finally think, I better start getting into something a little more serious. So I did get back to reading, about religion and philosophy, and not necessarily Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I went to a bookstore, I'd always stop in the religion and philosophy section first. And in the spring of 1977, I went to a Walden bookstore and went to the section and saw a book paperback, and it was called "The Fifth Gospel," and it had a picture of the face on the shroud that you see on the negative,
Mm-hmm.
which is the lifelike uh, posture. And
Right.
I thought, oh, this looks like an interesting book. I had heard of Veronica's Veil, which
Mm.
basically is a legend that some woman when Jesus was carrying his cross, went up to him with a cloth and, put the cloth to his face in an image form. Well, that's probably an image or a legend that's possibly related to having the shroud. Some historians believe that the shroud was actually folded up so that only the face was showing. And that actually makes a lot of sense when you think about, since the shroud's so big, it's 14 and a half feet long by 3.5 feet
Right.
wide. If you're going to show it in those days, you have to worry about the logistics of, of
Right.
showing that. So it would have been practical just to fold it up so that the face was showing. It would be easier to show, easier to carry, so on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so um, I bought the book, thought it'd be interesting reading, brought it home, read it in one sitting, and was just fascinated by it. And that was the year before the Shroud of Turin research project was given permission in 1978 to study the shroud for 5 days around the clock.
Right.
So the shroud was pretty well known in Europe up to that point, but not very well known in the United States. I mean, you could probably get your hands on maybe two different books in English on the Shroud of the United States. And just based on the evidence back then in 77, even before Stirp did their research, I
Hmm.
felt that the evidence was pretty strong that the cloth was probably authentic.
Hmm.
So it had a bibliography at the back of the book, and I started, searching those sources out
Sure.
and trying to get the books and articles and stuff. And then I contacted the Holy Shroud Guild in Bronx, New York, and
Hmm.
got some materials from them, and later got some 35 millimeter slides, which I later used when I started lecturing,
Right.
and started, trying to contact the scientists and that sort of thing. And the the whole exposure to the shroud kind of rekindled my faith, and I
Hmm.
ended up kind of going back to my roots. And within about 3 years, I had actually joined a monastery um,
Okay.
in 1980. And at that point, I started getting those slides together, and I started lecturing in the St. Louis area.
Hmm.
And I kept up with all the shroud research that was available at the time, which wasn't that much because that was the pre-internet age.
Sure.
And I went to my first conference in 1986.
Okay.
Uh,
Was that where there Stirp? Basically, was it a Stirp conference, or were there
um,
people from the original research project
yeah.
there? Or
Let's see. There
okay.
were there were three of the seven speakers were from Stirp. Jackson and
Okay.
Jumper, who had co-founded
Sure.
Stirp, and then Dr. Alan Adler, who was the blood expert.
Mm. Hmm.
And then there were let's see, Paul Maloney, who was an archaeologist, Gil Lavoie, who was a medical doctor, and then two skeptics, Joe Nickel and Walter McCrone.
Okay.
And so I did meet, I had corresponded with some of these people, but I was thrilled to actually meet them in person.
Sure.
And I started, writing articles later, and I've continued
Right.
that to this day. And I've now been studying the shroud for over 45 years.
Wow. Well, and so that was 1986. You said for that conference,
For the first conference I went
for the
to,
first
yeah.
conference. Okay. Now, was there so because our main topic here really revolves today around the dating of the shroud.
Hmm.
So maybe take us back to as far as so because I think a lot of people forget, or a lot of people when they're talking about the shroud, or you run into people who are skeptical that it. Again, I was skeptical that it's even possible that it's
Hmm.
authentic because of that dating, and
Right.
that's to, and obviously there's a lot of there's different evidence. There's a whole big discussion to be had that goes beyond just the dating issue. But there's a lot of people that stops the whole conversation,
Hmm.
of course. So, why don't you walk us through here a little bit as far as at least some of the main events. There was so much. Obviously, I have your book right here, the 1988 C14 dating of the Shroud of Turin, a stunning expose, and I have all the links in the show notes below. But if any of our viewers, of course, can see this is a pretty substantial work. I've been working my way through it, for a while, and it's very meticulously organized, detailed, footnoted. So, so that's to say that there's a lot more,
Hmm.
obviously, that we can cover in the show here. But maybe hit some of the highlights as far as after you have the Stirp team go over to Turin in 1978 to the 1988 carbon dating. Maybe fill this in for us a little bit as far as how this developed, in terms of the move to attempt to date this thing.
Sure. Okay. Well, there had been calls to date the shroud, I think, as early as the 50s. Now, it's important to remember that radiocarbon dating was only invented in the 1940s by uh,
Right.
Willard Libby. And in 1978, if they had carbon dated the shroud, and they weren't actually allowed to because all the testing had to be non destructive, and a
Hmm.
C14 test is destructive. So they weren't even allowed to do it. And if they
Was that
had,
part
they
of the original, like the arrangements with the Savoy family or with the church? Because there's a lot of players, of course,
yes,
involved in this whole thing the whole
yes,
time. Yeah. Okay.
yes. In fact,
Sure.
it's interesting to note that uh, what I note in the book, and then I also want to mention I knew that there would be extra material besides what's in the book So I have a paper on academia that's overflow, and I have about
Mm.
80 additional entries there that's done in the
Sure.
same format as the book. It's a supplement, but it kind of can be read as a standalone condensed version of the
Sure.
book, if you will.
I'll include that
Um,
also with the show notes too.
Great, thank you. But anyway, there's like 10 different entities that were involved in the C14 dating. And if there is ever example of too many cooks spoil the broth, I think this was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I guess both skeptics and pro Shroud people wanted to see the C14 because there's this conception which is kind of misguided in a way that C14 is 100% reliable and foolproof, and that's
Mm.
really not true. I mean, C14 can be very accurate, but it can also be wildly off. You know, most
Mm.
objects that are dated have been buried in the earth or wherever for a long time before they're
Right.
actually dated. And of course, we know the shroud has been around at least since the 1350s.
Right.
So, right there, you might have a problem given that it's been exposed to pollution and handling and whatnot.
Right.
But they thought they could still do a reasonably good test. If they had done it in 78, they would have needed a handkerchief size piece. And of course,
Mm-hmm.
the church wasn't going to allow that, even
Right. Right. Right.
if Stirp wanted to do that. So after the um, early 80s, when Stirp put all their uh, conclusions together, and they had concluded the shroud was the image of a real crucified man. There was real blood on it, and they did not know how the image got on the cloth. That was their basic conclusions.
Right.
So in 1984, they submitted to the church authorities um, a test proposal for 27 new tests, including C14. Okay.
Mm.
And by the late 80s, the um, new method called AMS, accelerator mass spectrometry, had
Mm-hmm.
advanced to the point where they could do it with threads rather than big pieces. Okay.
Sure.
So they started scoping out who could possibly do those tests. And the C14 labs wanted to do only the C14 test, whereas Stirp wanted to do another multidisciplinary test and the C14.
Mm.
Well, the C14 labs started maneuvering um, mainly after July of 1985 because it was at that point that Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI,
Mm-hmm.
approved Stirp's proposal for those 27 tests, and and they were going to get 2 weeks to study to do their second round of tests. They
Mm.
only had a week, 5 days the first time. They were going to get a
5 days. Yeah.
full 2 weeks. Okay,
Hmm.
and in late October of 1986, they had a workshop in Turin to determine a protocol for how the C14 tests would be done. And by that time, the C14 labs had pretty much convinced the church authorities to only allow the C14 test, which I think was a
Hmm.
big mistake. Um,
I wonder how they. It's just was that a trying to push some of the, I don't know, sort of competition away? Maybe that's the wrong way of putting it. But was it a insistence on the reliability of their method
yeah, well, pretty much.
that other methods weren't? You know.
Sure.
Okay. Hmm.
They were interested in promoting the new
Right.
C14 method. And
Sure.
get this, I mean, after the results of the shroud testing, C14 dating, the industry boomed. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry. And another
Sure.
interesting fact is originally they were going to have 7 labs take part, and they reduced it to 3. Now
Right.
the 3 that did it are still in existence. The 4 that were rejected, they're all out of business. What does that tell you? Um,
It's at least
so
suspicious.
yes, a lot of in those 800 pages. I have a
Yep.
lot of suspicious things and more
Yeah.
that
Expose
question
is the right
yes,
word.
yes, yeah.
Were those three labs, Joe? Just for those who aren't familiar with it, they were labs in I had it right
Oxford,
here,
England,
Oxford, Arizona, and
uh,
where was Switzerland another one
Arizona,
or
and Zurich, Switzerland was the third.
Yeah, Zurich. Okay, okay, and it was all under the sort of auspices of the British Museum, or the British Museum sort of, I don't know if ran it's the
Yes,
right word,
yeah.
but
Well,
yeah,
the head
okay,
of research at the British Museum was Dr. Michael Tite, and he was kind of
okay,
deemed the overseer.
okay,
So everybody was to report to him. The labs were
right,
supposed to give their data to him, and there were a couple screwy things with that right off the bat. One was that Teddy Hall, who was the head of the Oxford lab, was on the board of directors of the British Museum. So there's a
hmm.
conflict of interest right there.
Right, yeah,
And then the labs leaked the results before they were, the report was given. They weren't supposed to do that.
yeah,
And then after the results, Oxford was given a £1 million donation, which was given on Good Friday, 1989, to
hmm.
Oxford for ostensibly having proven the shroud to be a fake. And they
Hmm.
were given by rich, quote, they were just identified as rich businessmen. They weren't named. And Teddy Hall
Oh,
retired,
hmm.
and guess who got his job?
Hmm.
Dr. Michael Tite from the British
Mm-hmm.
Museum. Another little suspicious, couple of suspicious things there. So when did
It's
they
one of those
know
things
that
where
they were going to get
one
it?
thing would be like, but like this and this and this and put in puzzle,
Yes.
you can't help but wonder. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, let me back up just for a second, with the protocols, because you said so it was supposed to be seven, and again, how many samples were they supposed to take
Well,
total
originally
from
they
different
wanted to
parts of the
take,
cloth?
yeah, they were supposed to take three to make
Yeah.
sure that you got a representative sample,
Right.
because if you only take one and that sample is bad for whatever reason, you don't have anything to compare it with.
Right.
So
And it's like you
they
said,
had this,
it's an
yeah,
over 14-foot long and over
right,
3 feet wide piece of cloth.
sure.
There's yeah, yeah. Hmm.
So despite the fact that they had spent 3 days in Turin going over the protocol, on the day that the sample was taken, April 21st, 1988, a couple of Italians debated for about an hour and a half to figure out where the sample would be taken from. And they basically threw out everything that they had done in the 3 day
Hmm.
workshop in Turin. And they ended up taking it from one of the corners.
Mm-hmm.
As you're looking at the shroud, it's the lower left hand corner of the frontal image.
Mm-hmm.
And that area had already had a corner taken out and was always
Right.
held when exhibitions were held.
Right.
And yeah, it was it was the worst possible spot to take the one sample that they ended up taking.
I think I've seen like Renaissance era or late medieval kind of era,
Sure,
depictions of this, of
sure.
these public demonstrations. You see, church officials holding the cloth, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
they don't have
In that
any kind of
spot.
hermetically sealed or bulletproof, like any, it's not up. It's just, you're holding it. You take it out,
Sure.
hold it here. Everyone look at it, venerate it. People are kissing it, touching it,
Mm-hmm.
crowds of God knows how many people,
Yes.
so I would imagine that the cloth itself, like this is where, even if they would get permission to carbon date it again, under, like, let's say they had done it again just a few years later or something back before that, because we could have a whole other conversation about different dating techniques, because I think, as you
Mm-hmm.
put it on your book description, basically there's been many aging tests done, or estimates, and all sorts of different ways to estimate how old this
Right.
cloth is, and the only one that says it's
Mm-hmm.
not,
Exactly.
somewhere within a couple 100-year range of the time of Christ, is this one.
Right.
Like everything else says that
Mm-hmm.
it's at least likely, or at least possible. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, anyway, I just I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah. And by the way, they used to in centuries past, they used to exhibit the shroud almost every year, and it was exhibited in its
Mm,
history at least 275 times. Okay,
right.
and they held it in
Right.
that spot every single one of those times. All right, so it was the
Right.
worst possible place to take that sample.
Hmm.
All right, but they did it anyway, and so it's not, even though three labs got that sample, it's not three different samples. It's one sample
Right.
divided up into three. And
Right.
they did keep a reserve piece, which actually comes in handy later in some research to
Hmm.
show some opposite conclusions.
Sure.
Um, but it was just a fiasco from beginning to end, and it was a shame that the church eliminated Stirp because they knew the most about the cloth,
Hmm.
and the C14 labs knew very little about the cloth. About the only thing they knew was the fact that it historically surfaced in France about the 1350s.
Right.
So the date that they came up with was 1260 to 1390. And not
Right.
surprisingly, 1350 fits in that range. But I
Right.
have to believe that they were going to make darn sure that 1350 did come out. And we found out in 2017 from a Freedom of Information Act, um, because the labs did not release their raw data after the original test, which is unheard of in scientific
And
experiments.
that's I did not know that till just a few years ago. That you had the and if I can share here, just backing up a second, because this was um, from this Christianity.com just overview article that I've shared in the show notes here, talking about in the timeline here in 2005 that Ray Rogers, who had been, it says he was the director of chemical research for Stirp,
Right.
and
Hmm.
I guess he did this. Um, and by the way, I just want to throw this in there too, because there's this. I feel like there's this stereotype. Like, here's these really smart, learned, professorial men behind the carbon dating, and then there's these religious fanatic kooks, and
Hmm.
it's just so like the Stirp team. The more I learn about them, I mean, these are profoundly credentialed,
Oh yeah,
very well respected scientists of the highest order.
absolutely.
Um, Only a few of whom had necessarily like any strong religious convictions
Right.
per se. A lot of them are agnostic.
Yes.
Barry Schwartz is Jewish. So that's just completely unfair, denigrating on their
Hmm.
part, whoever throws that at them. But it points out here. It says that so he obtained thread samples from the same outer corner of the shroud that in 1988 was C14 tested, along with thread samples from the interior of the shroud,
Right.
and he proved that the samples were not the same. Basically, is what it's
Exactly.
pointing out here. That then he goes on to talk about the reweave, which I of course wanted to ask you a little bit about,
Mm.
because you've done extensive work on that, and I don't know if you want to talk about that at all now, or what's sort of in
Um,
play here with this notion of a reweave, or
um, yeah, we could work it in now, or I might backtrack a
sure,
little bit just
that's fine, yeah,
to set
whatever,
the
yep,
set the stage a little bit more.
yes,
But
please,
so um, yeah, and to make another point about Stirp, a lot of those guys, and there were a few women on the team. I don't want to slight them,
right,
but
right,
most of them were
right,
men. But most of the Stirp team worked in the U.S.'s space and nuclear programs. Okay, so
right,
these guys help build bombs. They help people put into space. When they went over to Turin in '78, a few of them thought, "Oh man, we'll find the paint in 30 minutes and we'll go home."
right,
You know, and that
yeah,
wasn't the case. So if if it was a painting or anything else, and there's no paint on the shroud, okay, that's
right,
one thing they proved.
right,
Um, you know, there's everybody's still trying to figure out how the image got on there. Um,
hmm,
so yeah, I mean, Stirp is always maligned in a religious zealot kind of attack
right,
all the time, and it's just not true. Um, so for a few years after the results were announced, kind of shroud research kind of dropped off quite a bit because people thought, and even Ray Rogers
Mm-hmm.
kind of accepted the dating. He says, well, if that's what they got, that's the date. And despite the fact that all the STIRP evidence seemed to point to a possible authenticity,
Mm-hmm.
science has spoken, so to speak.
Right. Right.
And a lot of a lot of people came up with different ideas why the dating could be off. Some people thought it was radiation from the resurrection, or bioplastic coating, or
Mm-hmm.
uh, extra carbon being added from the fire in 1532. And in 2000, my late wife and I were looking at some close-ups of the C14 corner, and my wife seemed to notice that the weave seemed different, in several different spots.
Mm-hmm.
So we got a really high quality uh, picture of the Zurich sample, and we sent it to a guy, a tailor here in Columbus, Ohio, who had been born in Europe and was European trained in the textile industry.
Mm-hmm.
And we sent him the picture. We did not tell him that it was a picture of the shroud. We just showed him the picture and asked for his observations. And he said that he thought that there had been some manipulation done in that corner. We thought,
Mm.
well, that's interesting, but he's only one opinion. So we
Right.
sent the same picture to a textile outfit in Albany, New York, and again did not tell them it was the shroud. And again, the person came back and said basically that she thought there were signs of manipulation. And we thought, we got two different entities saying that. So we sent the picture to a really high quality firm called Thomas Ferguson Limited, I think it's called, in England, or
Mm-hmm.
not England, Ireland, excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
And got the same, again, didn't tell them it was the shroud. And again, they said they believed it was manipulated.
Hmm.
So we thought, when we had three different textile places telling us they thought it was manipulated,
Yeah.
we thought, the repair idea could be the whole answer to this. So
Mm-hmm.
we presented a paper in an international conference in Orvieto, Italy in August 2000. And Barry Schwartz, the Jewish photographer you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
um, who's got the best shroud site on the planet called
Mm-hmm.
Shroud.com, which he
Also linked
started.
below.
Yeah,
Yep.
you'll if you get on there, you bring some food and snacks and a comfortable chair, because you'll be there a long time.
Yep.
Um, so he had started Shroud.com in 1996. It's still going strong. Wonderful source. And he came up to us afterwards and asked us if he could publish our paper on his site. And we said,
Hmm.
sure. So he uh, published it, and a month or two later, I can't remember exactly when, but
Mm-hmm.
Ray Rogers saw the paper there. And Ray was kind of upset with Barry because Ray had called us part of the lunatic fringe,
Oh,
and
okay.
we weren't bona fide scientists. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Ray worked at the Los Alamos National Laboratories, one of the
Right.
highest institutions in the world. Um, so, Ray was upset with Barry, and Ray said, "I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes." Because he did have samples from the main shroud from 1978, which he was allowed to
Mm-hmm.
keep as part of. He was on the team.
Mm-hmm.
The researchers were allowed to keep their own work and stuff, so he had legitimately had samples. And then he had been given some threads from the area right next to the C14 sample.
Mm.
So he got his microscope out, and Barry said that Ray called him about an hour and a half later, and Ray was a lot calmer, and Ray said, "I can't believe it. I think they're right." So um, then later, I think it was around 2000, late 2003.
Hmm.
Ray was given one of those some threads from the extra. Remember, I said they kept some part of the sample aside
Sure.
in 1988 for as a
From
reserve
the carbonate, right?
from the original sample taking. They gave
Yes.
Ray, the Turin authorities gave Ray some of those threads, and he
Okay.
found like the threads next to the C14 found this exact same thing. They were different. They were
Hmm.
chemically different. He found madder root
Hmm.
dye. He found gum, alum. He found
Hmm.
cotton. He found a splice thread that had linen at one end and cotton at the other. Everything
Right.
was there that you would have if there was a repair. So in
Sure.
January 2005, he published an article in Thermochemica Acta and said that uh, the dating was not valid because the sample was not representative of the whole
Hmm.
cloth.
And
So
do we
since
think that
then,
this might be back to the repair, that the sisters performed after the fire, likely, potentially,
um,
or maybe somewhere else along the way, or just it's
yeah, I'm glad
because
you
the
asked that because
yeah,
um, most
something I
people
wanted to.
think or assume, and even my our papers have been out there for 22 years now. We wrote other papers as well, and I've
Right.
continued the research individually.
Yeah.
Um, and in one of the papers, we said that we didn't think that the Poor Clare nuns were skilled enough to actually do what's called the French invisible reweaving technique. Now, they did
Okay.
put the patches in that you see, the prominent patches
Right.
that
Right.
had been in the cloth before they restored it in 2002. Um,
Sure.
but at the time, it was owned by Margaret of Austria, who is a part of the
Mm-hmm.
Savoy family that owned the shroud. And
Mm-hmm.
she had access to the best weavers in the land. And we
Right. So
believe
a
that
very professional job,
yes,
basically. Yeah.
yes, they would have had the
Hmm.
time and resources to do a thread by thread repair of the shroud, which is probably what was done. Um,
Yeah.
and so even a lot of people that accept the repair theory kind of um, think that we said, or they think that the nuns did the repair, and we believe that the French weavers in the court of Margaret of Austria were probably the ones that did that reweaving.
Hmm. It's just it's so incredibly interesting because you have so many different players, like you said, 10 about 10 different entities involved in this whole process, and it's just it's like anything else, I suppose. Most people are just going about their day, getting their kids to school or making sure the next bill's paid, whatever the case is. And all of a sudden you see on the news, oh yeah, Shroud debunked. And then you just go, oh well, I thought it was real, or oh, that's interesting, and you
Mm-hmm.
just move on. And then
Mm-hmm.
that's in fact when I was talking to I had Guy Powell on a couple
Paul.
weeks
Mm-hmm.
ago talking about his book, and something similar came up, just this idea, for him personally about, he was interested in it, then he heard that carbon dating, and then he sort of, I guess it isn't real. And then for him it was when he heard in 1997 about the fire, and this heroic saving of the shroud, and that got him wondering again, like, well, what's the big deal? I thought that thing was debunked.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a whole interesting reality, that this persistence, and for various reasons, some people, it might be a more religious devotion or personal experience, but certainly from the scientific side of this, there's just my own take as someone who's deeply interested in all things science, but is not necessarily gifted in that sort of realm myself that much, certainly not professionally or anything. To me, it's just, I'm not satisfied just leaving some of these mysteries, uninvestigated because of carbon 14 dating said that the cloth's not old
Mm-hmm.
enough. You still have this, like,
Right.
this image. I mean, the image is there. It's there. It has three-dimensional photographic information in it. Like, it's just, that's not an
Yep.
opinion. That's like, it's just so
Mm.
bizarre.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
and you got the negative quality, you got the
Yep.
superficiality. It's only on the
Yeah.
top several thousandths of an inch of the fibers.
Right.
You see it
No
best
brush
between
strokes. Like it's not paint or
right,
anything. Like it's
no
just on the
directionality.
individual fibers. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
there's no outlines. You see it best between about 6 and 10 feet. Now you have to, if you think an artist did it, you have to think about the psychology of an artist doing it. And if you
Yeah.
look at some of the features, they don't match. I know, why would an artist produce something that can only be seen well between 6 and 10 feet? If you're trying to
Right.
fool people, you're going to make it as clear as possible so that
Sure.
as many people can see it. You
Sure.
know, it just and it doesn't make sense that an artist
No.
could know as much as he would need to know to produce something like that.
Well, and I've been particularly fascinated by like from the medical sort of forensic aspect of it, like the details that had been sort of had been lost to time about the
Yes.
precise nature of a Roman
Mm-hmm.
crucifixion and all the little meticulous details that some of which you can't even see until you
Mm-hmm.
subject it to more hyper
Right.
sophisticated 20th or 21st century imagery. So, but
Exactly.
it's there, but it's completely
Mm-hmm.
invisible to the naked eye. And so yeah, so and again, like there's so many things to talk about with that, um, but I suppose I did want to ask you a little bit more about this. You mentioned before about the raw data being released, and I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if we can go back to that for just a
Oh,
sec.
sure.
In terms of maybe a little bit about just how strange that is, maybe, but and not to get too conspiratorial, but
Yeah.
conspiracies do happen. We have laws
Sure.
against them. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm. Yes.
there's that's the thing that annoys me too. Is anymore you just
Uh,
say conspiracy theory, and that just
yeah.
and then that means I don't have to listen to this person. I'm like, well,
Right.
it could be. I'm not saying it is, but so maybe walk us through this a little bit more about why that is strange or why that's unrepresentative of typically or
Yeah.
typical research like this, and then maybe a little bit more about what they discovered in some of this
Sure.
initial digging through that raw data.
Right. So it's just the norm in scientific experiments that when you finish an experiment, you release your raw data so that other scientists can check the repeatability aspect of the scientific method. And the
Because you're
British
right.
Museum.
Because if it can't be duplicated, or if
Hmm.
it's in theory it's not really science, then that's the whole point of
Right.
it. Is you need to be able to repeat it potentially, right?
Right. So the the British Museum refused to release the data, which you know raises some
Hmm.
eyebrows. It's like, why won't you release the data? And so in 2017, a French researcher named Tristan Casabianca uh, filed a Freedom of Information Act to get the British Museum's records pertaining to the 88 dating released.
Hmm.
And they were released. And what they discovered was that the labs did multiple testings and threw out a lot of the dates that would have skewed the 1260 to 1390 range. They just threw them out. Now, and then it becomes
Interesting.
a little clearer why they didn't release all the
Why
data
would
at
you do
first,
that?
because people would say, yeah, well, you can't
Hmm.
just throw out the dates you don't like to come up with a. Remember, I said they wanted to make sure they get the
That's what I was going to say. It
1357?
right. It
That
seems
helped
to
them do
heavily
that.
imply right that
Yes.
if you throw out dates that aren't in the
Mm,
range you're looking for in advance, that looks pretty suspicious. Wow.
yeah. And they
Did they
gave
did
the,
the British
yeah.
Museum, before this was released? I forgot to ask. Did they give any, like, in I'm because people were trying to get this for a while? What was their? Did they
Mm,
give reasoning? Did they give any excuse as far as
uh,
why they were
um,
supposedly we need to
no.
reserve this, or they just said
I
no?
I don't remember seeing. Yeah, basically, as far as I can tell, they just said no.
Wow.
Um,
Hmm.
and interestingly enough, Casabianca got three Italian authors, co-authors,
Hmm.
including two statisticians, and they co-authored a paper that was finally released in 2019 in a
Okay.
journal called Archaeometry, which, ironically enough, is published by Oxford University, one of the three labs
Hmm.
that did the C14 dating. And
That's interesting.
yeah, so
Hmm.
basically they said, well, didn't use all the dates, so the 1260 to 1390 range is inaccurate.
Hmm.
You just can't throw out dates and come up with dates that you like, so to speak.
Right.
So, and in 2019, I was at a conference in Canada, and Tristan Casabianca was there, and I said, by the way, did you also try to file a Freedom of Information Act to find out who all those rich businessmen were
Hmm.
that contributed £1 million to the Oxford lab? And he says, I did file one in 2017. And I said, oh, and the results? And at that time, and as far as I know, even up to now, he's not gotten a response about that. A little suspicious, maybe again.
You get into some
Uh,
some dangerous territory. Maybe, I don't
so,
know. This I grabbed here. I have my stack, my ever growing stack of things I need to get to and to read. But so I haven't. To be fair, I haven't read this one yet. But it caught my eye because and I'm not pointing fingers. I know nothing about his involvement in the original sort of test, but I know Doctor uh, Christopher Ramsey was on the original Oxford
mm-hmm,
team, I think, in the
right.
testing. And this was it was interesting because I know I've seen him in some documentaries, and
Mm-hmm,
um, I mean, to be fair, from the documentary, he seemed very open in what he was saying in the documentary to if new information comes along and all
right.
that. So I don't know if anything's developed, but it was called "Open Letter to Professor Christopher Ramsey" that goes through a tremendous amount just in a short article. It's from the Shroud of Turin blog spot. It's, I guess, Stephen Jones, does that, does
Yes.
Shroud, just neat Shroud links. But so I still have to read through that. But that's from 2018, and so I'm curious because he's talking in there just when I was looking over some of it about some of these things and related things. He also goes to like the art history and just trying to bring up some of
Mm-hmm,
the you might say circumstantial evidence, but some evidence that is good enough evidence to say, look, you know, you've got your 1988 dating, however that happened. Yes, okay, but you can't just pretend that there's not also all of this stuff
yeah.
that makes a compelling argument, at
Mm-hmm,
least, that we should at least be open to testing it again. So
sure.
to my knowledge, there hasn't been. I know it said in another article I was reading, I guess, that they have a request in as of 2019. I think it might have been Casabianca, a request in, or maybe it was a different group, I forget, to potentially conduct another dating, or to use different methodologies. Um, and so I don't know if you know anything. This is more of kind of like where we're at now, I suppose.
Mm-hmm,
There was this article a few weeks ago. I haven't gotten a chance to dig into as well as far as the technique, but this new X-ray based technique that's non-destructive that they just conducted, I guess,
yeah.
a few months back or last
Yeah.
year, that they
Mm-hmm,
published, and again, giving it a date of somewhere between like 250 BC and 250 AD, somewhere in that range. So I don't know, maybe as far as what as far as where we're at right
mm-hmm.
now with different requests that are in to maybe get more
Sure.
access to the shroud.
Um, well, not to put a downer on it right away, but Barry Schwartz has contacts in both Turin and Rome, and the
Hmm.
contacts have told him that there will be no testing under Pope Francis. Um,
Hmm.
so we'll probably have to wait
That's
to
just kind of
at least,
his.
yeah,
Yeah.
he just he's got a background in chemistry. Pope Francis does,
Right.
but
Right.
obviously he has a lot of things on his plate. I guess he thinks that
Yeah.
some other things are more important.
Well,
Um,
and I believe that if I'm correct,
mm,
when King Umberto died, the Savoy family seated, like, I guess it was part of this gifting of it, and that was that 1982. So the shroud
he
now
died
is
in '83, and
or 83. Okay.
he willed it to the living pope, and then
Right.
that was all finalized in 1985.
So that whatever the situation was before with access, the fact is that the living pope is the one who gets to decide whether or
Hmm.
not
Yes.
anybody gets. And maybe you get a pope who just for whatever reason just says, I don't want people messing with it. And that's that.
Hmm.
So that does give it a
Yeah.
little more. You sort of roll the dice as far as
Yeah.
if you're going to get someone who's sympathetic to it, but who knows?
Yeah. And as far as the different dating methods, given how much problems there were with the C14, if they do another dating test, I kind of doubt they'll use C14 since it
Hmm.
can be unreliable. and they had so much problem with
Right.
the 88 one, and there are new methods. Now, what I
Mm-hmm.
would say about that most recent method and a few others that were actually um, brought to light by that same scientist,
Mm-hmm.
Giulio Fanti. He wasn't the
Yep.
only author on there, but he was one of them. What I would say is this: these methods that they've used have been untried on a large scale.
Okay.
So I would say that there's hopeful aspects to it in terms of maybe able to use them in the future, but I don't think they're
We don't know
tried and
how
true.
wide scale reliable they
Right,
are
they
as
haven't been
methods,
used.
basically. Okay.
Yeah, many
Sure.
different scientists haven't really experimented with it yet, so
Sure.
I wouldn't put too much stock in it at the moment. And since we're not going to have new
Right.
testing anyway, it's not. I don't think that's a big deal.
And to be fair, I know we always, it's a human thing. We have to beware of confirmation bias, because, for me
Hmm.
personally, I believe the Shroud is authentic. And
Hmm.
I believe that I can point to a number of pieces of evidence that for me personally have convinced me it's authentic.
Hmm.
That being said, when I like I just brought that example up. When I saw that a few months ago, I went, "Yay! There's a
Hmm.
good test." You know what I mean? Like there's that
Hmm.
sort of immediate.
Right.
If it verifies, what I already believe to be true, I tend
Hmm.
to, So I think we all, as human beings, tend to kind of struggle with that when it comes to our own
Yes.
objectivity. And I suppose it would be a challenge with an additional carbon-14 dating because for me, I mean, if they do another carbon-14 dating and it comes back and says the Shroud's much older, I would be inclined to say, see there, now it's working and the old one didn't. Whereas someone who's a skeptic might then doubt the
Hmm.
new one, and
Sure.
so that is
Exactly.
to be fair, I'm sure that's a big challenge,
Hmm.
that we don't want to make light of that, of course. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
well, Joe, I don't know if there's anything else. I mean, we could we could go on all day here, but
Mm-hmm.
we're pretty close to sort of the time we set aside. I don't know if there's anything else you want to just share as far as if someone were to ask you the title of what this video is called, "How old is the Shroud of Turin?" How would you answer that question as best you can, or what would you
Um,
direct them to consider?
well, personally, I believe it's connected to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Um,
Hmm.
People often ask me what I think caused the image, and my short and sweet answer is I don't know. With probably some form of radiation or light, but I
Hmm.
think there's a connection between whatever caused the image and the image that we see on the shroud. The
Hmm.
shroud is literally the most intensely studied artifact in human history,
Right.
not just relic,
Right.
but
Hmm.
artifact. And,
Artifact.
you
Period.
know,
Right.
artifact, period. And given the, just the STURP scientists alone, I think they would have been bright enough to figure out if it had been a forgery. Now, you always have
Hmm.
to give the probabilities room to say, okay, well, maybe someday we will find it to be a fake. I don't think that'll ever happen. But
Right.
people have to look at the evidence. And if I could make a plea, I would people, if you're interested in the shroud, do some homework. I've seen so many
Hmm.
skeptics on podcasts and whatever who have not read a lick,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
just come out,
Right.
oh, it's a fake because I believe it, and stuff.
Right.
The shroud's
Or it's
complicated.
got to
You
be
got to do
paint,
some
and
research.
it's like, oh,
Yeah,
come on. Right. Right.
yeah.
Yep.
I think
Or
if you
where,
do some
and John
research,
Jackson talks about this too, where
yeah,
like you have someone who will make a skeptical video or podcast or something,
mhm,
and they'll try to poke a hole in one aspect of it.
one
But I know John
aspect,
Jackson has always pointed out you have to take into account all of the data that is in
right,
it. Like the image exists. Like you have to
right,
take all that into account. You can't cherry pick.
right, exactly. It's a complicated subject. I've been studying it for 45 years. I'll be studying it the rest of my life. It's an interesting subject, whether believe it has a connection to Jesus or not. It's a mystery, and if it is
Hmm.
connected to Jesus, it can give you some real good insights into the nature of faith and what's going to
Hmm.
be on the other side of life when we get there, and things like
Yeah.
that. And I think that's why a lot of skeptics are afraid of it, because if it is
Hmm.
authentic, they might have to change their worldview, and that gets very,
Yeah,
very scary. Whereas
it
people that
does.
the shroud, if you believe the shroud's authentic, most people would say, okay, I think it's authentic, but if it was proved fake tomorrow, it wouldn't affect my faith. So it's
Right.
going to have a bigger effect on a skeptic who doesn't
Sure.
believe in Jesus than a pro shroud person.
So for in my case, like if it is authentic, it can, as I think it is, it tends to, fuel or nourish the faith I already
Enhance, yeah,
have, right,
right,
rather than completely change my worldview. That's a good point too. Yeah. So to be
yeah.
maybe an appeal to be merciful in conversation too. If you're a believer and
Yeah,
you find someone who's maybe more of a skeptic, it's a lot to process
yeah.
potentially. So yeah. Well,
Yeah,
Joe,
there
thank
are
you so much for
psychological
coming on.
factors.
I
Yeah,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, and I just
yeah.
and thank you so much for your work, for your contribution. You and Sue's work here has just been so um, fascinating and continues to be. Like I said, I was unfortunately unable to get the whole way through the book here, before the
Mm,
interview, but I'm hooked. It's just fascinating, and
mm.
like I said, I'll have the links below. And anything else that you want to share as well, I'll make sure to get that from you, and we'll
Okay.
include. So, but yeah, and I'll definitely keep in touch for potential future
Yeah,
developments.
I'd be happy to come on anytime,
Yeah,
Mike.
great. Well, thank you so
And
much, Joe. God bless you.
thanks, Mike. Take care.
Really fascinating stuff, huh? And then we're barely scratching the surface here. And I just, getting back to what we were talking about there near the end, the importance of having, I think, an honest, open, charitable conversation about this. I mean, personally, like I said, I believe the Shroud is authentic. I would argue with someone who thinks it's not. Argue in the sense of I would attempt to present why I think it's authentic. I would hear this other person out as to why they think it's not. Might disagree. But I'm not going to go out there, oh man, if you don't believe the Shroud's authentic, you're an idiot. Well, that's ridiculous, and that's just not the way we should be as Christians. Unfortunately, a lot of times I will run into occasionally, folks, most of the time it's very positive, people who are interested. And a lot of you have given some incredible feedback. And please feel free to share what all of this has meant to you, and any questions you might have. Feel free to put them down in the comments, or go to thegraciousguest.org. You can contact me directly through there, through my website, through the contact form. So, yeah, and not just about this, by the way, but any other topic you might want to discuss. But I think we should just be able to have this conversation. And if you are a skeptic, if you are someone who, maybe flat out thinks it's a hoax, I just want to encourage you and everybody else, too, all of us, to be charitable in how we discuss this, and to look at the fascinating evidence, to try to look at all of it, to not cherry pick it, like I was saying, and really be willing to follow where the truth leads. Okay, just good advice, I think, in general for life. And I want to end with this. This is a great quote on the question of what is the Catholic Church's official position on the Shroud. So the Catholic Church doesn't have one. There is no, you have to believe this or you have to believe that. So the church is very open. The church's attitude is study the thing. And as Joe was saying there, Pope Francis, at the time of recording this, doesn't seem interested in allowing any further research. That could be for a number of reasons, just respect for the Shroud, or there's other priorities. And fair enough, that's his call, okay? Future popes may allow that. We'll have to see. But the bottom line is that there is a tremendous amount of respect for all of us, who believe it's authentic, and encouragement to, prayerfully consider what we can learn and how we can connect more deeply with Jesus in his passion and his suffering, and what we can learn about the crucified man on that cloth. And I love this. There's an embroidered expression in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist where the Shroud is kept. In Latin it says, "Tuam syndonem veneramur," and by the syndom, I guess it's related also to it's the Latin term. I think I said the Greek one earlier. Maybe. I have to look that up later. My bad. But here's what it says in Latin. "Tuam syndonem veneramur Domine, et tuam recollimus passionem," which means, we venerate your shroud, O Lord, and we meditate upon your passion. So, we don't worship a piece of cloth. It's a piece of cloth. Even if it is this incredible relic, we worship Jesus Christ, Son of God, who loved us so much that he came here to die for you, for me, for every single one of us. Jesus died for the person you like the least, the person I can't stand the most, the person who I hope I never see again, right? That attitude we can often have. Christ died for that person too. And so for me, I think the shroud is a reflection on mercy, a reflection on love, a reflection on a willingness to give every last drop of blood in sacrifice for the least of us, right? The one who deserved it the least. He gave all of that for all of us. And hopefully that can encourage you to reflect on that deeper value, that deeper recognition, I should say, of the value that you really are, how much value you have to God who loves you and who would do anything and has done everything to offer infinite mercy, peace, forgiveness, and eternal life to you. So something to think about today. God bless you guys. Remember, check out thegraciousguest.org, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.